I'm going to be talking about a method called collaborative poetics. This is a method, as I say, that I developed in work that I carried out over the summer in a pilot study at the Participatory Cultures Lab in Montreal, McGill University. And the idea is that it brings together social scientists and poets, and that they come together as a research collective, as equal participants in the process, without one kind of having more power than the other. And they pool their knowledge and they pool their skills in that. So the social scientists bring with them their knowledge and understanding of social scientific theory and methods, and the poets bring with them their knowledge and understanding of poetry writing. And in the case of the work that I did, I was working with spoken word artists, so they also brought their knowledge and skills around the performance of poetry as well, because for me that's also quite an important thing, but it doesn't necessarily need to be spoken word artists. It could be more kind of poetry that's meant for the page. And the idea is that they work together to produce creative, innovative texts that don't look like your kind of standard academic journal articles. So what we did was we put together a spoken word show. We put together a chapbook, which is this book here, quick plug, which if anyone wants to buy one is £7. And we put together some spoken word poetry videos as well. And these are texts which talk about people's individual experiences, in this case of discrimination. So they're talking about people's individual experiences, but they're trying to do something more with that. They're trying to link to broader social issues, issues of social scientific relevance, they're trying to illustrate social scientific theory and points and so on. And so it's bringing together three sites of expertise. It's bringing together the expertise of social science, it's bringing together the expertise of artists, and it's bringing together people's expertise on their own lived experiences as well, which is also really important, and which is something which isn't perhaps always given the kind of, what I feel should be quite a central kind of place within this kind of research. So why poetry? This is slightly tongue-in-cheek. This is what happens if you do a Google search for social science is and poetry is. And it is kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's also kind of making quite a serious point, I think, because it says something about how social science research is perceived. It says something about, how we understand social scientific knowledge, or how it's understood more generally, and how it's understood as being perhaps something which isn't real, which isn't useful, which isn't relevant, which isn't meaningful. And then if you do a search for poetry you get this idea that poetry is about truth. Poetry is on the streets, it's something which is relevant, it's something which is meaningful, it's something which is accessible. Poetry is necessary, poetry isn't a luxury. And so I think it's really interesting what that says. But I think that what poetry brings to this kind of research collaboration is a whole range of things then. It brings a potential for new audiences. People will listen to and access artistic texts who won't access or understand or find interesting academic texts. So people will go along to a poetry show who aren't going to go along to a conference. People will read poems who aren't going to read journal articles. So it expands it to new and different audiences. But it also isn't just about taking the same old knowledge and transmitting it to different audiences. It's also about producing a different kind of knowledge. So it also produces different insights and different perceptions through working with the arts, through working with poetry and poets. It brings in things like subjectivity, emotions, humanity, which are actually things which we tend to kind of sideline in social scientific research. We tend to not be present as researchers. We tend to not be, even if we're dealing with incredibly emotional topics, we're not supposed to be having emotional responses to those. And we're not supposed to be representing emotions in your text. You can read texts about really, really sensitive and emotive issues that are just so dry and so kind of empty in a way. And poetry in the arts allows us to kind of bring that back into research. So why social science research? And actually this is the question that I've struggled with most, funnily enough. And the more collaborative research that I do, and the more arts-based research I do, the more I've struggled with this idea of what actually can social scientists bring to the table? Why don't I just write a poem about it? It would very often be a lot quicker, a lot more people would listen to the poem, and it kind of feels like, well, maybe I could just write the poem and skip all of this stuff. And I actually have really struggled with that, but I've thought about it a lot, and in doing this kind of research I've come to the conclusion that there's good news for the social scientists. Actually, I think the social science part is really important too, and that's really necessary too. I think that it's important, and probably actually the most important thing is the status and the authority that it brings to particular voices and to particular narratives. Dr. Helen Johnson of the University of Brighton can say things that Helen Johnson the poet can say, but will be listened to. Dr. Helen Johnson will be listened to, Helen Johnson the poet won't be listened to. So it brings a certain status, it brings a certain authority, which actually is really important. And even if that's the only thing it does, do you know what, that's really important, and maybe that's enough actually. But it also brings other things as well. It brings an access to different audiences again, to different funding opportunities, and it brings a theoretical basis to the research which can help us to articulate and justify the purpose and the outcomes and applications of a piece of research as well. Social scientific methods, tools, frameworks and considerations also allow for systematic, in-depth and robust investigations. So I found that through doing the Montreal pilot study, for instance, we spent about 3 weeks talking about discrimination, writing about discrimination, doing a whole host of different activities about discrimination, and we then decided as a group that we were going to interview each other about discrimination, and we were going to analyse those interviews. I really was wondering what on earth that was going to add at this point. We've been talking about discrimination and writing about it for about 3 weeks, but it really did. It really took things to a different level. It allowed us to look at things in a different way. It allowed us to bring our narratives together. It allowed us to do all sorts of things which we couldn't do just through the discussion and the art sides of things alone. So actually that's really important too. And then the last thing is about facilitation and making it happen. Actually, I think it's really important that these voices are heard. I think it's really important that these narratives are out there, and somebody's got to do it. That doesn't need to be academics. Some academics, by no means all academics, some academics have great skills around facilitation, around collaboration. And so can be a kind of useful person to come in and facilitate that stuff. But I don't think it needs to be academics who are leading on this kind of research, and really that's part of the point of today. Actually, I think any one of you could lead on this kind of a project. But I do think that social science brings with it the authority, it brings with it systematic research, a theoretical framework, a body of knowledge, it brings with it sets of resources, and it brings with it a certain impetus. So actually I think that you do need both components. And so I think that you need to bring them together, and this is where arts-based research comes in. There is loads I could say about arts-based research. For anyone who's interested, and I know that a couple of you were there, I gave a talk in November specifically about the pilot study, and I talked more about arts-based research then. There's a link to the video from the talk. It's just like one of those slide capture things, so it's me talking and the slides. But there's a link to that in the further readings at the end, and it's not, I don't think, in the copy that got sent out, so you might want to kind of jot it down when we get to that bit. But that will fill in some of the gaps if anyone wants to know more about that. I don't want to talk too much, otherwise it turns into a lecture on arts-based research, and that kind of isn't the point of today. But the point really is that there are a lot of intersections between, and actually I kind of, from you guys introducing yourself, I don't think I need to say this, you guys already know, there are all sorts of points of intersection between the social sciences, between academia and between the arts. People tend to talk about them as being kind of like complete opposites, and they're really not. There's all sorts of creativity involved in academia, for instance, and in social sciences. Arts-based research is a really broad umbrella term, and it's about approaches which in some way use the arts either as a form of data collection, data analysis, or data dissemination, or it could be all three in the way that I did with the pilot study and have done in other places. Very often the most common form is probably for data dissemination. So one of the things that you see sometimes with arts-based research is a fairly sort of standard research where I go out, I do my research, I get my data, I analyse my data, and then I go along to an artist and I ask them to kind of articulate it artistically to do something with it. Or I go on and develop not just academic publications, but I do a play as well, or I do some poems as well. And that's sort of relatively common. But actually, something that's also very common in arts-based research is that it does a bit more than that, actually. It isn't just your sort of standard research made pretty, but it disrupts established frameworks and epistemologies. It gives us new ways of thinking about knowledge, new ways of creating knowledge. It opens up new ways of telling stories and new ways of doing art. So very often, arts-based research is something a bit more revolutionary and a bit more transformative than just saying, here's my research, make it pretty. I need to bring in autoethnography here, but again, that's kind of like a whole other lecture to talk about autoethnography, but it's an important kind of jumping off point. Autoethnography can take lots and lots of different forms, but in its evocative form, it could be considered to be a kind of arts-based research. So autoethnography is basically autobiographical writing. So I'm writing about myself and my experiences, and I'm doing it in a creative way, but trying to make connections in the process. I'm not just talking about myself, I'm talking about broader social issues and social contexts and so on, and illuminating those through that process. So it's pretty pertinent to kind of what we're talking about. It's something which can be transformative and aims to be transformative. It's not just describing the world, it's trying to change it in some way. And it's very relevant to this kind of method, to the collaborative poetics method. But the reason that I brought in the collaborative bit is because autoethnographies are typically written by researchers writing about their own experiences. And they can be amazing, and they can be really transformative and eye-opening. Sometimes they're not so amazing. And when they're not so amazing, very often it's because actually the academic isn't schooled in, doesn't have the skills for creative writing. You know, just because you can write academically or can write a journal article doesn't mean you can write a good poem. It doesn't mean that you can write a good story. And actually, you know, I think it's very important that we get together with the people who do know how to do that stuff. Hence the collaboration. We get together with poets who know about writing and they know about performing poetry. And I think that that's really important. So weak autoethnography can be weak writing and also weak research. And it's very important, I think, that we try and get the strengths of both and not the weaknesses of both. So I've got a quote for the next slide. This comes from somebody called Kip Jones. Kip is a kind of pioneer, I guess, of an approach called performative social science, which I don't have time to go into. There are some references at the end about it. And there are a lot of points of intersection between the collaborative poetics approach and performative social science. But Kip can be very direct, and there's this wonderful acerbic quote of his about what arts-based research isn't and where it goes a little bit wrong that I wanted to show you. It certainly isn't taking interview transcriptions, leaving out a line or two here and there, rearranging it on the page in stanza format, mimicking poetry, and then passing it off as poetic inquiry, or even worse, calling ourselves poets. It isn't thinking that our lives are so precious and unique, the snowflake phenomenon, that surely the world wants us to dramatise them. Too often through embarrassingly intimate performances of overcooked angst. Typically to captured conference audiences, academics present these hysterics by crawling around the floor for half an hour and calling it dance. Or by producing a monologue that seems literally to have lost the plot, never having a narrative arc or conclusion. As audience members, we often wish we had chosen the parallel book launch with free sherry instead. And I wanted to show you a very short video as well. This is from a duo called The Anti-Poet, a music poetry duo. And they're kind of saying the same thing in their own way. And apologies if anybody has sensitive ears, there's quite a lot of swearing in this. Sorry if anyone's very sensitive to swearing, there was quite a lot of it in that. But I think it makes an important point in the same way that Kip does here. I think it matters whether what you are producing is effective and whether it's good and whether it's saying something. And I think that a lot of the time, that means collaborating with people who know how to do that. I think it's really important. The collaboration element is really important. Both those elements are important, the poetry and the social science, and you need to have the skills and the knowledge in order to carry those out. And I know I'm actually only talking to about half an academic audience here, but certainly there's a tendency amongst some academics to feel like they can kind of do it all. And if you can do that writing, that academic writing, you can do the poetic writing as well. But actually, as you can tell from that video, not even all poets can do it. So, okay. That's why poetry, that's why social science, that's why to do it reasonably well. Why collaborative research? Collaborative poetics is about collaborating with two different groups of people. It's about collaborating with artists and poets, and it's about collaborating with individuals, community groups, people who have stories to tell. It could be that that's the same group as in the case of the pilot study. I was talking to poets, working with poets about their experiences of discrimination, so it's the same group, or it could be that it's two separate groups of people. Why collaborate with people? I think I kind of made that point, because social scientists don't know everything, because social scientists can't do everything, and equally poets can't do and don't know everything. You need the expert knowledge of participants, you need the expert skills and knowledge of the artists and of the social scientists. And certainly as academics, I think it's really important to drop our preciousness and our grasp on power. It's a very difficult thing to do, actually, to drop our kind of cozy status on the platform as the knowledge creators, the people who get to say it's true. But actually, I think it's really, really important. So this is about challenging who has the authority to create knowledge. It's about empowering and giving voice to individuals. It's also about acknowledging the role of social scientists as political players, this personal is political idea, about explicitly working to change the world in ways in which we think are desirable, rather than saying we are lab-coated academics who are standing outside and labeling the world, and we are somehow separate from that world that we're looking at. So it's about breaking down power differentials and challenging inequalities. And the quote here is from Debbie Young Annette Africa, who is a African-Canadian poet, talking about how the personal is political, the political is personal, micro is macro, macro is micro. So choosing to speak is a political act, and we need to think then about what we talk about and what we don't talk about. I don't want to go on about principles of collaborative research particularly, because again that's another lecture and I want to get onto the workshop part as quickly as possible. But this is just some of the kind of reference points, particularly for anyone who's interested in kind of locating it more in academia, around critical psychology, community psychology, performative social science and participatory research. Just some of the kind of jumping off points really in academia. So why do collaborative arts-based research? Well, because there's a potential to engage larger and broader audiences with the stuff that we're doing, with the narratives that we have to say, with the research that we're carrying out. And this is about access to those audiences, it's also about engagement with those audiences as well. Because we can create texts that are arguably more meaningful, more powerful, and more fun than standard academic texts. And do you know what? I think the fun bit actually really matters. And it's very often kind of dismissed. If something's fun, it's somehow not real or authoritative. But actually, you know, you can make a point in the way that the anti-poet do there, in a way that is very fun. But it's still authoritative, is still kind of important. It allows for multiplicity, fluidity, and ambiguity. These are things that kind of mainstream, even qualitative, even innovative qualitative research methods actually really struggle with. Even things like, say, interpretive phenomenological analysis, for anyone who's aware of that kind of method, or thematic analysis, still want this linear kind of thread. They want one story to tell and struggle with things that are on the edges, that are liminal, that are kind of unspoken, that are fluid, that are multiple, that are ambiguous. Qualitative research, social scientific research really struggles with that stuff still. But the arts are all about that a lot of the time. So actually the arts are kind of really important in that respect. It can empower and give voice to participants, giving them the space and resources to explore their experiences and the authority to create knowledge. It's something we kept coming back to in our summer work, about the fact that, which is where that picture from the previous slide came from, that we were questioning it. Who do we think, you know, who are we to say that this is what's going on? Who are we to say that this is important? Who are we to say this is discrimination? Because actually the people we're used to saying that stuff and listening to are scholars, they're academics, they're scientists, they're the powerful people. It's not usually us. And actually I think it's very important that it is us, that it is artists, that it is everybody who has the power to create knowledge. So it's about democratizing that, if you like. It can enact social change within and between communities in that personalist political way, connecting our personal experiences to the bigger picture. And then there's this whole impact thing as well, which anyone who's an academic will be very familiar with. But there has been a move in recent years, and it's all part of the ways in which academics are kind of ranked and scored and measured against one another. But there's been a move to measuring impact rather than just where we get published, or looking at sort of what journals we get published in and who's citing our work, but actually thinking about whether we make a difference with our work. And there are problems around this, partly in terms of how it's measured and how it's judged. But actually the general move is quite a useful one, because it suggests that there's more of a focus on outcomes and not just outputs. And I think that this is something that actually collaborative arts-based research can be really, really strong on. I'm going to skip over this fairly quickly. These are evaluative criteria that I kind of mined from Jones's work on performative social science, but they apply to this method too. But they're all kind of important in terms of creating good arts-based research work. These are some of the things that I think you need to think about. And I added the last one of aesthetics because I think that although it's very difficult to judge what a good artwork is, it's also very important that if you're producing arts-based research, it isn't just good research, it's also good artwork, because it will not be effective otherwise. People won't listen to it, it won't have an impact, it won't be meaningful in the same way. If you're writing a poem, it needs to be a good poem that you're writing. And I'm not going to have a discussion about what a good poem is because that's another 5 hours, and we still won't have decided at the end of it. Okay, so leaping into the pilot study, as I said, I talked about this in November and I don't want to just kind of repeat that, but I do need to say a little bit about it because it makes sense of this method and everything. So I got together, as I said, with 7 young spoken word artists. I worked together with them as a research collective, so we worked as co-researchers over a 6-week period. We met for 3 days a week during that time, so we had about 18 days of working together, full days. And I came to it with this aim of developing the collaborative poetics method, and then within that to create social scientifically informed spoken word poems which explored co-researchers' experiences and understandings of discrimination. So that's kind of what I came to the table with, and pretty much everything else was worked out in collaboration with the co-researchers, and that includes these themes. We put these together because we realised that actually discrimination was this enormous topic and we needed to pin it down somehow, and so we came up with these themes to guide our writing and guide our research. Exploring facets of privilege, questioning our conditioning, making connections between personal experiences and bigger issues, unpacking flaws and subtleties within ideals, and exposing microaggressions. And microaggressions are the way in which most of us experience things like discrimination, actually. It's things like somebody being served ahead of you in the queue even though you were at the front of the queue. It's things like not seeing yourself represented. It's these really subtle small things that kind of build up on a daily basis. As I say, we created a spoken word show, we created a chat book, and we created some video poems as well. And I am writing an academic article as well, so we do this kind of standard academic stuff, but for me the important outputs were around the poems. So I thought that you should hear some of the poems, really. There's a couple of poems I'm going to put up as examples around the activities that we're doing. But I wanted to read a poem for you, which is one that I wrote in the project. So I did have the advantage of being a poet for this project, but I participated then in all of the poetry activities that we did as a poet. So I wrote stuff when other people were writing stuff, and if people were responding to a prompt, I responded to a prompt and so on. But this is a poem that came out of the general project work rather than coming out of a specific activity that we did. And it's about it's kind of about my son, who is depicted in glorious Technicolor here. So it's beautiful. You tell me that my babe is beautiful. Those eyes you gush. I know. They're the bright blue flashes of a kingfisher in flow. His skin is petal soft and orchid white. You're right. Maybe he should be in the movies. Golden ringlets curl this audience around his chubby little finger. Beautiful. I've heard it so many times now, it's almost lost the power to make me cry. And so I sigh and say, we know, his mama and I. We know he has to be perfect, so thank God he is. Because 2 women with a baby, you've got to get it right. We've so much darkness here. He is our light. So when you say he'll be a heartbreaker, I don't protest. What's an unrequited tear or two against the pride that we invest? And there'll be years of mother's love between those broken girls and here. Please make it girls. He is so near to being perfect. He must be beautiful, so thank God he is. Wears winsomeness like only white boys can. He should be in a catalogue. It's true. I see him there. And on every brazen billboard, every floodlit page where beautiful is sold to us in shades of blonde and beige. He is our moon, our ever-waxing light. So yes, of course, you're right. He is beautiful. He is first class, 5-star, top-notch, top drawer. It's stamped through him like seaside rock, sweetness to the core. He's beautiful like your child, but just a little bit more. Okay. And then I wanted to show you a short video. This is a reflexive video that one of the co-researchers put together, and it talks about their experience of creating a specific piece on the project, but it also gives an insight into the project as a whole and what it looks like from the perspective of a co-researcher as well. That was Xander, one of the co-researchers, talking about their particular perspective on the project, and so I think it's nice to kind of have that voice in there. We're currently doing an evaluation of the project and looking at an evaluation of focus group and interview data with the research collective to explore what it kind of did for people in a bit more detail. But what people have said about it and our kind of preliminary analysis suggests that it was really powerful in a lot of ways in helping people to develop their writing, develop their thinking around discrimination, feel empowered and an ownership of their experiences and authority to create that knowledge. And also in terms of transforming how they interacted with the world. So people said that they would do things like challenge instances of discrimination when they saw them in the future, rather than stay quiet about it in the way that they had become used to doing. The last little bit of talking that I want to do before we actually do some of this stuff is a kind of overview of sort of bringing it all together and thinking about the kind of how-to stuff in a more broad sense. I'm not going to talk about this very much because I think that I've said about all the things that go into it. But I wanted to use a fire triangle here because I wanted to show that these are all interdependent ingredients that are necessary for the fire to ignite and be sustained. You need the fuel of personal experiences, you need the heat of poetry and spoken word, and you need the oxygen of social scientific theory and research. And you need all three of those in order for this to kind of take off in the first place. But some of the kind of how-to stuff, that things that you need to think about for the outset if you're doing this kind of research are things like timings. There needs to be a balance between the intensity of sustained periods of working and time to breathe. One of the things that I found from my work in the summer was that we didn't have enough of the latter because we were working over a very intensive 2-month period. But actually a lot of the thinking about, writing about things takes time. And so you need to kind of get that balance right. The aims and the focus of a project is clearly very important. Ideally, as with all of the other aspects on here, this should come from the participants themselves, rather than being something that you're kind of taking to, as a project lead, that you're kind of taking to the table. But it really does depend on the project, and collaborative research isn't an all or nothing thing, it's a continuum. So I came to the table with a certain set of ideas and aims, and my co-researchers described their participation in the project. One of them described it as being like being a partner in my research, which worked really well actually, and I think is a really good description of what we did, and it didn't need to be anything else. So it's a kind of continuum. In terms of outputs and audiences, the main thing I would say is be conservative with a small c and don't try and do too much. We did an awful lot from 6 weeks, but I wouldn't go into a project expecting to do all that. I would expect to come out with a book or a show or a video poem or something like that. And again, ideally, that should come from the participants themselves. The funding, all of this stuff has to be paid for. It's going to depend on what you're trying to do, what questions you're asking, the nature of the research, how collaborative it is. But one thing I would say is that it's really important that the poets are paid. I know a lot of you in this room are artists, so you will know what I'm talking about. But there is this tendency to say with artists, oh great, you can get some exposure, it'll be fun, you know, in a way that you wouldn't say with, say, academics. You know, it is really, really important that those skills and that knowledge is recognised, and people are making their living doing this, and so poets need to be paid for the work that they are doing. But also everybody needs to get something out of this, whether it be financial or something else. But if this is going to be true collaborative research, everybody should be getting something out of it. Nobody should be being kind of used for somebody else's ends. I'm talking about poetry. It's all about poetry, and I'm specifically talking about spoken word. It doesn't need to be. The principles that I'm talking about here could apply to other art forms, and arts-based research applies to the whole kind of broad spectrum of the arts. But it's really important that whatever art form you're using, you understand it and you appreciate it. You don't need to be an expert in it. That's the whole point of collaborating with people, but you do need to know what you're looking at, because without knowing that, you won't know about the opportunities it affords, you won't know about the constraints that it has, you won't understand what you're working with and all of the ingredients that you need to bring to the table. So it's really important that you know about and you think about the art form that you're using. You don't just unreflexively go, oh, I use poetry. Why poetry? What is that doing? What's it achieving? What are the constraints that brings, and so on. And then the research collective is really key, and this might be the very first thing that you do, because it could be that a group of people get together who want to tell their stories, and then everything gets built up from that, or it might happen in a different kind of an order. But it is very important that it is collaborative, and that the group dynamics are probably the single most important thing for this kind of project. It doesn't mean everyone has to think the same thing, or say the same thing, or have the same experiences, even if that's possible. Actually, contrasting voices can be really rich. But managing that, you want contrast and not conflict. And so the group dynamics are really, really important in this kind of thing. And then I would say that you want to dive in with it as quickly as possible, as early on as possible. The bad news is that I don't have a set of nice, standardized, systematic steps to give you, because there aren't any. I haven't found any in this kind of arts-based research, and I think it's because it's not possible to create them. Actually, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The nature of collaborative research and the nature of arts-based research is that it is a different beast, with different people and in a different context. So all I can really offer is a set of stages and a set of kind of tips and techniques, and then the actual kind of getting our hands dirty and doing some of it ourselves. So I put together some research stages, and these are kind of more conceptually distinct than anything else, because really in reality there's a lot of overlap. You might be moving between them, you might be moving around. But the first stage is around knowledge exchange, so establishing the group, establishing the project, working about, what the focus of it is, what kind of format it's going to take, and then learning about both the art form and the theoretical and the methodological underpinnings. The second stage is around skill development, so learning about doing this stuff, learning about doing the art form, and learning about using research methods, and continuing to define the project aims and the scope as you go through, because we're talking about something that's a kind of iterative, repetitive process. And then you're starting to think about sharing stories, people actually kind of bringing their stories to the table, exploring and developing people's understandings, their experiences, their stories, their narratives. And creating and disseminating output. So you're writing stuff, you're creating those innovative texts, you're doing the video poems, you're doing the poems for the show, or you're doing the chapbook. And then the last stage is around wrapping up, the evaluation and the moving on, and there are a series of things to consider there around how and whether you stay in touch with participants and so on. So I set up a Facebook group with my co-researchers, and I still use that to communicate with them. So I tell them about when I'm doing things like this, and I run things through them when I'm doing something, and ask them if that looks okay to them. And so we're still kind of carrying on that dialogue, but that might not happen in every case. And this looks really nice and smooth, and of course it's not going to be nice and smooth. So I also thought about some stumbling blocks and challenges that you might come across in these different stages. And this is just an example of some of the things that might happen, that might kind of go a bit wrong and need to be dealt with. Lack of group cohesion early on, reinforcing power differentials. It can be a problem with, for example, this learning about theoretical and methodological underpinnings. One of the things that we did was I gave a load of lectures around things like critical psychology approaches to discrimination, and community psychology and the sort of theoretical underpinnings of it, and research methods, and how I perceived the project as being. And it worked really well in our project, but there's a real danger around that as well, because it's sort of sets up this teacher-student dynamic, and it sets me up as being the person who's telling you how it is, who's being the authoritative knowledge creator. So it's something that you need to be kind of aware of and careful about. Failure to learn and teach skills adequately, lack of engagement, conflict and imbalance in the group, and those last two are really things that could kind of happen at any point really and continually have to be kind of negotiated. We had a great group and had very little problem with that, but sometimes things are very subtle and implicit, and actually it was only in talking to people afterwards in the evaluation a couple of things came up that I hadn't realised had been conflict and had been a problem. So about being sensitive to that as well is important. And then stage 3 is actually a massive kind of step up, if you like, because the first two are relatively straightforward. They're about kind of sharing what we know and what we can do as a group. After that, you start sharing your stories, and actually that's a big step. And that's where people are starting to kind of emotionally invest much more in the project. And so there's a lot of potential there for things kind of going a bit wrong, for people becoming anxious, for group conflict, for people not engaging, for people dropping out, and there's all sorts of things that can kind of happen at that point in a project. And then in the last stage, there are things that can happen around not being able to keep in touch with people when you want to, around lack of a safety net or a follow-up. And I've put abandonment of participatory principles, and I'm really thinking of academics there mostly. In that it's very easy, and what very often happens with collaborative research is you get together, you have a wonderful collaborative project, and then the co-researchers go off here and the academic goes off over here and writes everything up and tells, they are the person who gets to tell the story, they're the winner who gets to write the history, if you like. And the co-researchers don't get a role in any of that. Or maybe you show them the paper, but you don't really expect them to say they don't like it. And it can be quite difficult to follow through those participatory principles all the way to the end. So one of the things that I'm doing is where and when it's possible, I'm asking co-researchers if they want to be co-authors on papers and other things that I write. And they don't always want to be, actually. So it's not, they might not necessarily want to play that role, but I'm giving them the option of doing that in the way that I would expect to happen if I was working with any other group of researchers. And I think it's really revealing when that doesn't happen. It really makes me wonder, are they really co-researchers, or are they just, participants who did more than your average participant? So there's all sorts of kind of things that can go wrong and so on. When we did the focus groups and the interviews, I asked the co-researchers as well, what tips would you have for anyone who was going to do this project? What tips would you have for a participant, a poet, an academic who was going to do this kind of work? And they said things like, allow yourself to be vulnerable, but also really take care of yourself. Most people were really surprised by how emotionally they were affected by the project, how it really got to them. And they really thought that, they really changed emotionally. They were really, really affected by it emotionally, even if they weren't expected to be. For poets, throw yourself into it and write, make the most of it, really go for it. And then for academics, they said things like be open-minded. Now this is towards the topic, to people's experiences. I was able to write about discrimination, but it might be that you're working on something that isn't kind of your topic. And then it's even more important to kind of listen to other people's experiences and to take a back seat on that. But also being open-minded to having your powerful role challenged as well, and your understandings of what research looks like and what things should be like challenged as well, which is very difficult for a lot of academics. So being open-minded and listening, being prepared for messy emotions. So one of the co-researchers said, you can't expect to come into something like this completely distant and sterile and actually get anything out of it. You can't treat people like a chemical environment. And then appreciate the art. They did say, if possible, be an artist. And they liked the fact that I was a poet because it meant that I understood what I was working with. But I do think, as I said before, you need to understand the art. You don't necessarily need to be good at it or an expert in it, but you do need to understand it. And that's where that collaboration comes in too, talking to people and understanding about it. That's why, hence the knowledge and the skill exchange. There are lots of things that I could say in terms of my tips and tricks. I think I've already really talked about a lot of them, so I don't want to repeat myself, and I do want to get into the actual activities. But I think I do want to say that the single most important thing is to be flexible. I'm the kind of person who likes to prepare everything. I like to know exactly what I'm saying and what I'm doing. So the idea of going into a 6-week project not knowing what I was doing after the first 2 hours was pretty terrifying. So what I did was I put together this, which is this massive, great resource pack, and it's got in it activities, it's got readings, it's got lecture notes and workshop notes, it's got a whole wardrobe of different things. But I went in knowing that I might not open this for 6 weeks, or that I might look at it but look at it in a different order, or I might use it in a different way to the way I'd expected. So this for me really helped, actually. I did loads of preparation, but then I knew that I could go into the room and just rip this up. And you know, we used some of it we didn't use. You know, it was just something that I knew was there. Like you go, oh, well, yeah, I've got something about that. Yeah, we can talk about that. So you can go in with a plan, but you need to be prepared to rip it up. If you're going to take collaboration seriously, the whole point is you don't know. You can't do all that planning. You can't go in knowing exactly what's going to happen, because you're going to get together with a whole load of other people who have their ideas and their skills and their knowledge and so on. So developing a toolkit, these are the kinds of things that we did and that Collaborative Poetics kind of brings in. Group discussion and decision making is a really big part of the work. So talking about everything from the aims of the project, the timetable of the project, the outputs, self-care, and the timing of this is quite important. If you do this too early on, then the group very often aren't confident or can't make an informed decision about this stuff, so it's actually kind of counterproductive. But if you do it too late, then you're not really giving people the chance to kind of feed into and shape the project either. So the timing is quite important. And we had academic inputs and artistic inputs. So we had things like research methods workshops. I gave workshops around things like interview technique, designing interview schedules, thematic analysis. I gave lectures on things like discrimination. We had a load of artistic inputs. We had 4 artists come in, which was really, really useful, from outside the core research collective, who are local spoken word artists, to give masterclass workshops. And that was great because it acted as an incentive payment, actually, to the co-researchers who weren't being paid for this. And so for them, they were young, emerging spoken word artists. Masterclass workshops were a big kind of catch. It helped to build their skills, but it also meant that I could just sit down with everybody else and write some poems and just be another participant. So it was really important for that stuff as well, for kind of breaking down those power differentials. We also did things like writing prompts, sharing and editing writing. If you're doing this kind of work, be prepared for the fact that most of the writing is not going to happen in sessions. The sessions will be about inspiring writing, discussing the issues, talking about things, exploring things, sharing what you've written, editing writing, but not about the actual writing. And so there is a lot of work that goes on but that doesn't go on in sessions from everybody. It's a big investment, this kind of research. And then in terms of putting it all together, we did things like reflexive writing, which is about critically exploring your own position within the research and the effect that it's having on you. For us, it was an important kind of self-care tool. It was an important way of looking after ourselves, as well as an important kind of research tool.